Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 37 today. Over the last 2 weeks, we looked at this topic of a shifting landscape in the United States. Now we're going to look at the same idea in Western Europe. So this will be a very broad look at major events that are going to take place from basically the 19th century and up in Western Europe that will affect the history of the church and Christianity in that area. And so we won't cover everything in detail. In fact, we won't cover very much in detail, but we'll hit a lot of the really big high points. And then as we go through the rest of the study, we'll be able to narrow that down and look in more in depth in the most important ones. But again, just expect that this is going to be a very broad approach and look at some of the really big events that are coming up that are going to greatly affect not just history in general, but specifically the way that the church is going to develop throughout this time period in Western Europe. So a big event as we've looked through this season so far has been mentioned several times is the French Revolution, but we've not actually looked at the French Revolution. So obviously that's going to be a huge event that is going to have long-lasting effects both in France and the rest of the Western world and the world in general, but then also within the church. So today's the day we're going to finally look at the French Revolution. Louis XVI was neither a good ruler nor a wise politician. During his reign, economic conditions in France grew steadily worse, while expenditures of the king and his court soared. So one of the starting points for the French Revolution is that at this period of time, there's a very great economic downturn in the country, and the government didn't really respond to that. And if any of you know about this period of time, you know about Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, that whole deal. And it's just an example, whether it historically happened exactly that way, but it shows the attitude of the rulers, of the aristocracy and those in power, that although for many people in the country things were very, very bad, and we're talking starvation bad, for them things just kept rolling in. They kept living a luxurious lifestyle. And so that's not going to go over well when there's economic issues. And we see this throughout history and in our own country as well, both in the past and even to some extent in the present. So this is going to be one of the big points of emphasis. This is going to be one of the big kind of powder kegs that's going to come along that's going to make this volatile situation get even worse. The crown sought funds from the nobility and the clergy, two groups who had been free of taxes. When they resisted, the king called the Estates General, the French version of Parliament. It consisted of the clergy, the nobility, and the bourgeois. So here's a kingdom that's not doing well economically. It needs money, but the money's not going to go for improving the country. The money's not going to go for the benefit of everyone. The money's not going to go to try to help those in the poorer classes or whatever thing that you might be able to say is justified. The money's going to go to continue the upper class and the ruling class living in the luxurious lifestyle in which they become accustomed. So nobody's going to want to pay this. And traditionally, these groups were not the ones that were going to pay for anything to happen. And that's the nobility and the clergy. They weren't going to be paying taxes. They were free of them. And now all of a sudden the king's coming to them with his hand out and saying, all right, it's time for you to pay up. And he's got to figure out a way to make them do that. Since the king planned to use the Estates General to force taxes on the clergy and nobility, his ministers advised him to arrange things so that the bourgeois would have more representatives than the other two. The bourgeois is the group of those three that would be very glad for the clergy and the nobility to start taking on some of the load because they're already having to pay. And so the king knew, and his advisors knew that there's three groups. Two of them don't want to go my way, but one of them definitely does. So how can I use that? How can I arrange that so that one group can outweigh the power of the two? Steps were also taken so that the clergy would be represented by not only the bishops and other members of the hierarchy, but also by parish priests whose sympathies would run against the interest of the nobility and the religious hierarchy. So here's the way that the king and his representatives decided to do it. First of all, three groups are not going to be equally represented. The one that's going to be on our side, we're going to have them have more. And they're going to actually end up with more in the bourgeois group than the other two combined. But just to hedge my bets, I'm also going to go to that clergy group, and instead of the people that are at the very top, the ones that are going to be affected by, having to have these taxes paid, I'm going to fill it up with people a little bit lower down the rung, and they're going to be more sympathetic with the bourgeois group than they are the nobility and even that upper group of the religious group. So really kind of in a double way, making sure that things are going to go the king's way and setting this up to not be a very fair process at all. When the assembly gathered on May 4th, 1789, the third estate had more members than the other two combined, and among the clergy, less than a third were prelates. So the third estate is the bourgeois, and their group combined, their one group had more than the other two combined. So right off the bat, that's crazy. You can't think that anybody's going to say that's a fair process. And within the clergy, they so stacked the deck that less than a third of them were that hierarchy group. So over 2/3 are the lower group of the religious clergy that are going to be more on the side of the bourgeois, and then the bourgeois outweighs the other two combined. So the deck is stacked, and is about as stacked as you can get against the nobility and the upper echelon of the clergy, and the king set it up that way. When the sessions began, the third estate insisted that the assembly function as a single chamber with decisions to be made by a simple majority. Now here's the next part. As they set this plan up, we're all going to meet together. The way that it had traditionally been done, and the way that the other groups would have liked for it to have been done, is we're gonna meet separately, and then we'll come back together. And you've got three groups, regardless of the fact that one has way more than anybody else. You've still got three groups weighing in. Well, this way there's just one big group, so majority is going to rule. It's not going to be a deal where there's three and one, the kind of the checks and balances type of deal. That got thrown out the window. They don't want that. It's going to be a majority rule, and if it's majority rule, then they don't even need to meet, because the decision's already been made, and because they had the voting power, they got that done. Then some of the priests, resisting the aristocratic leanings of the prelates, joined the third estate, and finally these groups declared themselves a national assembly, arguing that they represented the majority of the nation. 2 days later, the clergy voted to join the National Assembly. So now you've got a split group that's come out with the bourgeois and eventually the entire clergy group against the nobility. And now things are really going to be crazy, because this is something completely different than what they started with, and it cuts out the group that would have had the most interest in keeping things the way they had been rather than the way the king wanted them. So the king couldn't be more pleased with the way things are going, but as usually happens with this stuff, it's not going to end up going the way that he wants it to ultimately. As these events were taking place, the economy continued to worsen and hunger became even more widespread. So all this crazy stuff's going on. The king's trying to get more money out of the people that actually have some, and meanwhile, people are starving to death. So not a good look for him. Fearing the actions that the National Assembly may take, the government closed its meeting hall and ordered it disbanded. So now the group has been told you can't meet. And we don't want to go along with what you're going to come up with, because we know exactly what it's going to be, and it's not going to be fair. Well, do you think they went along with that? No, they disobeyed, vowing to stay in session until France had a constitution. So seemingly a noble cause, but it really wasn't. The king moved troops to the outskirts of Paris and deposed Jacques Necker, a Protestant banker and government minister who was very popular among the bourgeois and the Paris populace. So the king's making moves to make sure he continues to get what he wants done. The people of Paris responded with a series of riots that culminated on July 14, 1789, when they took the Bastille, an old fortress that served as a prison for the king's enemies. Now we're seeing the people have had enough, and they're going to continue to have enough for a while. And it's going to end up being a revolutionary type of thing. They don't want this anymore. They've had it with it, the whole deal. They riot. They've taken the Bastille, that's where the king kept all his enemies. So now those people are free, and things are not looking all that great for that king. From that point on, things moved rapidly. The king capitulated before the Third Estate, ordering the other two to join the National Assembly in a new body, the National Constituent Assembly. So the king's going to continue to try to get things done. This group issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was to become a fundamental document of democratic movements both in France and other nations. So this group's going to come up with something that's actually going to be for democracy, not for a king. And so things are rapidly not going the way the king wanted them to. When the king refused to accept this and other decisions made by the assembly, the populace of Paris rioted. From that point on, the king and his family were virtual prisoners in the capital city. So things have gone way off the rails for this king, and it is not looking good for him at all. And if you know anything about your French history in this period of time, things are not going to be going well for him and his family. The assembly reorganized the nation in civil and economic aspects along with its religious life. The most important step in the reorganization of religious life in France was the promulgation of the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. So we'll look at that document in just a moment, but this assembly ends up turning over the whole apple cart. I mean, they want to change everything. And that's exactly what they go about doing. And it's not, and when we say everything, that's everything. It's going to affect the religious life. So they've got some definite ideas about what they think should be happening as far as Christianity goes, and any kind of religion, but obviously Christianity is going to be the main one there, almost exclusively. And there's going to be some different opinions about this, but they start with this document. So let's look at this Civil Constitution of the Clergy. The National Constitution Assembly felt that it had the authority to regulate the life and organization of the Catholic Church in France. The abuses within the church also led them to feel a reorganization was necessary. So it's France. The Catholic Church is going to be the main church, but there's Protestant as well. But they're setting their sights on the Catholic Church first and foremost. And they have looked at it and said, there needs to be some changes here. And so they're going to try to do some Reformation work, and some reorganization is going to be a part of that. The highest positions in the hierarchy were held almost exclusively by members of their aristocracy and were not used to shepherd the flock, but rather to personal gain. So the same problem we've seen with the church almost from the time of Constantine on. Not every single church, not every single country, not every single year or period of time, but consistently it comes back over and over and over again. These high positions in the church that should be responsible of taking care of God's people are given to people in power so that they can, instead of taking care of God's people, gain from it personally and enhance their own power. And we see it here again. People have once again recognized this is an issue and something needs to be done about it. Several ancient monasteries and abbeys had become centers of leisurely and luxurious living. So again, we've seen this before. There were also many members of the assembly who were convinced that the church and its faith were remainders of superstitious times now past and should be destroyed. So this is the big difference of this movement from others for a long time in Christian history. Now there's a group in power that wants to try to get rid of the church, and not for the same reasons that groups have tried to get rid of it in the past. In the past, it was things like the Roman government, saying that they had different religious beliefs, and because of that, they want to get rid of it. It always has to do with giving the people in charge more power. But the reason that this group has come up with is they reject the idea of religion and God altogether. They look at it as being something that they need to get past in order to get to this new era of freedom and rights of man and all this other stuff that they want to do. It's not all of them, obviously, but there's definitely a group that's this way, and they're gonna hold some sway in this. Most of the measures included in the Civil Constitution were intended to reform the church, but what was at issue was the very question of whether the assembly had the authority to issue such a decree without consulting the church. So again, this is the Catholic Church. Do we have the power as a nation to order the church to do what we want? And obviously, depending on who you are, you're going to have a different answer to that question. The government in France at the time is going to say, well, yes, we do. The Catholic Church and the Pope are going to say, well, no, you don't. And so what are they going to do about that? The king tentatively agreed to the Civil Constitution pending the Pope's agreement, But secretly, the king had already consulted with Pope Pius VI, who informed him that the civil constitution was a schismatic document that he would never accept. The king kept trying to convince the Pope to change his stance in secret. So the king's trying to get the Pope to sign off on this. The Pope is telling the king, there is no chance in this world that I'm ever signing off on this, so stop asking. But the king doesn't let the rest of the government know about it. He keeps putting them off, and he's thinking, okay, if I put them off long enough, I can get the Pope to change his mind. No, you're not going to get the Pope to change his mind, but he's living in a time where he's a virtual prisoner in his own home anyway. So things are not going well. He's hanging on any kind of hope he's got. And it may not be much, but at least he's thinking, man, if I can pull this out, maybe I'll be okay. And he wasn't okay. Finally, the assembly simply decreed that all who held ecclesiastical office must swear allegiance to the civil constitution, and that those who refused would be deposed. So their solution to this was, okay, if you don't go along with this, if you don't swear allegiance to what we have put in place, maybe we can't force you to, but we also don't have to allow you to serve in your church. And we also don't have to continue to support you. And so that was their solution. Go along with it or else you're out. And if that had been all it was, it would have not been great, but it ended up being worse than that. The net result was that the church was divided. In theory, those priests who refused to swear would suffer no other punishments besides the loss of their offices. But in reality, those who refused to swear soon became the object of persecution. So a new era of persecution comes to the church, and it is within the country of France, which they had been beyond persecuting Christians. It's typically been the Protestants, but now in this situation, it's more of the Catholics. And what should have been just you make your decision, you can stay or go, you can serve or not, becomes actually that there's going to be persecution involved. Well, these events in France are going to also influence things in other countries as well. Meanwhile, revolutionary movements were gaining strength in other parts of Europe. This, in turn, inspired the French revolutionaries to more extreme measures. They start to see that other countries are following their lead, and that emboldens them. And so they go even further into what they think things should be. In 1791, the National Constituent Assembly was succeeded by the Legislative Assembly, in which there were far fewer voices of moderation. So they're going to have a more radical group as a result of this. Half a year later, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, beginning a long series of armed conflicts that would continue until the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So another era, another little period of time that France is going to be involved in war. Again, nothing new for them, but they kind of had been in a little bit of a peaceful situation. Now that's not the case. When the war turned against France, the assembly directed its wrath against the king, who sympathized with the foreign monarchs and the aristocrats. So one more black mark for the king in their eyes. At the Battle of Valmy, the French were able to halt the enemy's advance. The next day, the National Convention took the place of the Legislative Assembly. So now we move to another group, the National Convention. And on its first session, the convention abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the Republic. So now we have the Republic of France. French Revolution is in full effect. The monarchy is done away with for now. And what does that mean for the king? 4 months later, under accusation of high treason, the king was tried, convicted, and executed. But this did not put an end to the nation's problems. Under direction of the bourgeois, the national economy was able to do little for the urban poor, and conditions were no better in the countryside. So the Republic is now in charge. They realize the king can't stay alive because he has too much influence, and so they trump up charges against him and kill him. Well, they may not have trumped him up. He may have done what they said. Regardless, they killed him. And we know family members died as well. And that didn't make everything better. There were still a lot of problems in France. It wasn't just the king. The optics of what the king had done were not good, but it wasn't just the king. The group comes in, the bourgeois comes in to take over the economy, and the economy does not improve. So there's definitely going to be other things that are going to have to be taken care of to make France better. The peasants in the region of La Vendée revolted. Fear of foreign invasion mounted. All this led to a wave of terror where everybody was suspected of counter-revolutionary sentiments, and most of the major figures of the revolution were put to death one after another at the guillotine. So not only did the king end up dead, but the side that opposed him, that started the revolution, they ended up dead too. Nobody was happy. Nobody had fixed the problems. And as a result, again, the people had had it, and they were willing to go after the very ones who had started this whole thing. So that wipes out the first generation of the French revolutionaries, and it brings in another group that's going to come along. The new leaders of the revolution saw themselves as leaders of a new age in which science and reason would overcome all superstition and religion. So this is the more radical group that's come in. They're the second wave, and they're the ones that do want to get rid of religion, which would be Christianity for France, because they think that this is the age of science and reason. And we don't need the superstitious beliefs of the past. We don't need all this stuff. Let's wipe it all out. We're going to go along with science. We're going to go along with what we can rationalize. And anything that has to do with the supernatural or any of that kind of stuff, get rid of it. We're moving forward. We're moving to a new day. And that's what this leadership of this new group wanted to try to do. It was on this basis that the French Revolution created its own religion, called first the cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being. The civil constitution of the clergy was forgotten, for the revolution wished to have nothing to do with the church. So they basically started their own anti-religious religion that is all about reason and science and not really believing in anything to do with God, and to supersede what the role of the church was. And they even went even further than that. The calendar was changed to remove religious elements, and new great ceremonies were developed to take the place of religious holidays. So they want to change everything. They want to try to get rid of anything that has influenced the culture that has to do with Christianity. Well, I'm sorry, you really can't do that at this point. I mean, you can try, but you're going to change the calendar. You're going to change what I call a day. It's no longer Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They even went so far as, because the 7-day week has to do with, or is directly because of what Genesis says about God working for a week. He did it 6 days and he rested on the seventh. They didn't even want that. So they made the week a 10-day week. So no longer 7-day week, a 10-day week. People are not going to go along with that. I'm sorry, they're not. Even if they believed what you were saying is right, they're not going to disrupt their lives that much just because somebody doesn't like the idea of, Monday being called Monday, or having 7-day weeks, or that we celebrate Christmas. It's just not going to happen. And so these things were not received, but they tried. Temples to reason were built, and an official list of saints was issued, which included Jesus, Socrates, Marcus Aurelius, and Rousseau. Jesus Christ in that group is funny. You can tell they still were influenced enough by people, and maybe even in the back of their mind, to not leave Jesus out. They knew they had to leave him in there, but they throw him in with Socrates, Marcus Aurelius, and Rousseau. Crazy. This is just crazy, but these are weird times in a lot of ways. Our very government and the way that we believe about things like freedom and liberty and all this comes directly from this. And yet there's also some really bizarre things going on that didn't really 100% carry over, thank goodness, but the little seeds of it did. And we see some of the results of that in our day and time too, I believe. But anyway, these were kind of weird times. These changes were not suggested, but forced. So they're telling people this isn't something you just decide to do. This is happening. The promoters of the new religion made use of the guillotine with cruel liberality. So if you didn't go along with their changes, they just would kill you. All priests were required to swear before the altar of freedom or be sent to the guillotine. You think the priests are going to do that? They didn't. As a result, between 2,000 and 5,000 priests were executed, along with several dozen nuns and countless lay people. Interestingly, the Catholic Church group, the priests from the church, they held the line stronger than the Protestants. A lot of the Protestants went along with this. They were already kind of not the favored group anyway, and they went ahead and just did it. They would, not all of them, but More of them than the Catholic group just kind of went with the flow. The Catholic group is actually the one that stood strong and said, no, there's no way this is going to happen. And as a result of that, a bunch of them were killed. The Reign of Terror ended in 1795, but official government policy continued opposing Christianity. In 1798, the French invaded the Papal lands and returned with Pope Pius VI as a prisoner. So they took this to a big extreme by going and getting the leader of the Catholic Church and bringing him in chains. And that's what they did. Napoleon Bonaparte became master of France in November 1799. He was convinced that the best policy was to seek a measure of reconciliation with the Catholic Church and therefore open negotiations with the new Pope Pius VII. So Napoleon comes in and he kind of wants to smooth things over the church. He's not crazy about them, but as so many rulers before him, it doesn't matter about personal beliefs. It matters about personal power. And whatever can help me to gain as much of that as I can get, that's what I'm going to do. And he goes along, he's not some big proponent of the church, but he sees that making peace with them is going to be more beneficial for him. Finally, in 1801, the papacy and French government agreed to a concordat which provided for the naming of bishops and other prelates in such a way that the interests of both church and state would be safeguarded. What we see here is what you call a compromise. Neither side gets exactly what they want, but they're able to coexist as a result of that, and that took till 1801 to come to that point. After Napoleon became emperor of France, he decreed religious freedom for Protestants, so the Protestants are actually going to be looking better now. Though his coronation was presided over by Pius VII, they soon clashed, and France again invaded papal lands. Pius was taken prisoner and remained such until the fall of Napoleon, when he was restored to Rome. So Napoleon, he goes along with whatever he thinks is going to help him, just like so many rulers before him. If the church helps me, I like them. If they don't, I don't. He likes Pius at first. Pius comes and he oversees his coronation, but then they clash and they go and they take the second pope, 2 in a row. They bring them back in chains, and we're going to see the results of that coming up. So as all these events are going on in France, there's going to be a big effect from what they have going on with the rest of Europe, and it's going to be a kind of a new Europe. The Napoleonic Wars had created chaos throughout Europe. After Napoleon's defeat, the main powers that had opposed him, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, determined the future shape of Europe's political map. So the war that Napoleon fought and lost, the groups that were directly opposed to him, they get to be the ones that kind of decide what's going to happen next in Europe. The borders of France were set where they had been before the Revolution, and the House of Bourbon was restored in the person of Louis XVIII. So the king's back, the republic's gone, king's back. Most of the monarchs whom Napoleon had deposed were restored to their thrones, so kind of the status quo is back in play. It was hoped that these arrangements would bring peace to a people tired of war. These hopes were not ill-founded. With the exception of the Crimean War and the Franco-Prussian War, the rest of the century was a period of relative peace, but under the surface, social and political tension led to conspiracies, revolts, and upheavals. So while there weren't a lot of wars during this period of time, there were a couple, but not like they had been, there's still a lot going on under the surface that's not all that great. One of the biggest sources of unrest was the quest for national unity among Italians and Germans. Neither Germany nor Italy had yet achieved political unity, and in each of these countries there was a growing sentiment that the time had come for political unity. So while all these other nations had kind of gotten it together and unified and nationalism had taken hold, Germany and Italy hadn't gotten there yet. And this is late in the game for them to get there. So this is going to be a big source of trying to get this straightened out, and there's obviously going to be groups that don't want that to happen. These goals were opposed by the rulers of Austria, whose domains lacked cultural unity and included vast areas of Germany and Italy. A network of international spies and saboteurs developed with the clear goal of preventing German and Italian unity. So Austria tries to stop this from taking place. Economic liberalism was enthusiastically embraced by the growing mercantile and capitalist bourgeois. At the heart of this philosophy was the doctrine of laissez-faire, which held that the law of supply and demand sufficed to regulate the marketplace, and therefore no government regulations or restraints were necessary. So you may read that sentence and think, or a couple of sentences and think, that doesn't make sense. you're saying economic liberalism, but then you're given a philosophical approach that in our current day would probably be more along the lines of what conservatives think. Well, you got to go with what's happening at the time. At the time, this was very progressive. The idea that you would just let a market be free and not have the government running it, that was what was progressive. That was what was liberal. Now, over time, that has changed. It's not the way it is now. So don't let those terms confuse you. You have to remember that it's at their time. So at one time, what we consider to be standardized and very conservative, and maybe even in some of people's opinions, outdated ways of thinking, that was actually the cutting edge. It was actually what everybody was, or a lot of people were afraid of. Oh, don't let us get into that liberal territory. Let's go back to what we're used to. At one time, these ideas that we now look at as being status quo or conservative even were actually the progressive viewpoint. The theory also held that as capital grew and industry developed, the economic status of the poor would also improve. Such economic liberalism often went hand in hand with political liberalism. The struggle between these ideas and earlier absolutism had different results in various countries. In Spain, Ferdinand VII restored pre-revolutionary absolutism. In France, Louis XVIII showed greater prudence by establishing a parliamentary system. In Germany, Prussia became the champion of national unity, and in Italy, some sought national unity while others wanted a republic. Finally, Catholic Belgium became independent from the Protestant Netherlands, and France crowned the more liberal king, Louis Philippe d'Orléans. You see now there's a wave of change coming through Europe. For most of them, they're moving more progressive for the day. Spain's the exception, but the majority of the other countries are moving more with the trend of what's kind of taking place in France and what's going to go on now for quite a while. Looking further, in 1848, there were new revolutions in Germany, Italy, Belgium, Great Britain, Switzerland, and France, and primarily this had to do with rioting people that were not happy. Switzerland gained a new constitution, while in France, Louis Philippe was overthrown and the Second Republic was proclaimed. So monarchy out of France again, republic back in. In 1851, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published their Communist Manifesto. It actually didn't get a lot of attention at the time. It's a big deal now, obviously, because of historical events and where it's going to end up bringing people to. But when it was published, it was just kind of like nobody really paid attention to it. The map of Italy began to change in 1852. By 1861, the new Kingdom of Italy included the entire peninsula, excluding the territories of Venice and Rome. Venice was annexed in 1866. So by 1866, Italy, the Italian peninsula, is completely unified with one exception, and that is Rome, which is the territory of the papacy, the church. Under French protection, the papal states were able to retain independence, though it was constantly threatened. So France, who had kidnapped two popes, is now the one that's going to come in and try to protect them, because the ties between France and the Catholic Church are not going to break, in spite of everything that was going on in France. And they're going to try to protect the papal states from Italy absorbing them, basically. But in 1870, King Victor Emmanuel of Italy took Rome and completed the unification of the peninsula. The king granted the Pope a guaranteed annual income, along with 3 palaces that would be considered an independent territory: the Vatican, the Lateran, and the Castel Gandolfo. But Pius IX refused, and it was not until 1929 that the papacy finally agreed to the arrangement. So the way things are going to ultimately basically end up was offered earlier. The church resisted it. It doesn't mean that they stayed 100% independent, but they fought it. So they're going to eventually not be able to fight anymore. It's going to take till 1929, and finally they'll agree to the arrangement, but it was already in place basically in 1870. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck excluded Austria from the German Confederation. He then molded the Confederation into a single nation. After 10 years of military conquests and skilled diplomacy, Germany was united under Wilhelm of Prussia. So Italy becomes united, now Germany's getting there. Catholicism was looked at as obstructionist, and liberal Protestantism was preferred. Bismarck took several measures against the Catholic Church, including breaking diplomatic relations with the papacy expelling several monastic orders, and cutting the traditional subsidies given to the church. What you're going to find in this period of time in Western Europe is a better time for the Protestants than the Catholics. It's not 100% good time for the Protestants. There's some problems for them, but it went way better for them than the Catholics. This was a bad time in history for Catholicism in Western Europe and basically in Europe. So they're not going to have a good time. The fortune will change, of course, but at this period of time, Catholicism is going through a rough time. Among the most significant developments in European Protestantism during the 19th century were those derived from the growing separation between church and state. The state of affairs began to change following the French Revolution. So we're finally starting to see widespread separation of church and state that hasn't been the case since the time of Constantine. And there's actually more to this. I wanted to, instead of writing it all out, I want to read this to you. If you're watching this by video, if you're just listening to it, you're not going to see it. But I'm going to actually read this from the book. What exactly does that mean? What is the separation of church and state in these countries? And let me quote here from the History of Christianity, Volume 2. Quote, in the Netherlands, for instance, the union between the state and the Reformed Church was broken when the French conquered the land and created the Batavian Republic. And after the Restoration, the links between church and state never returned to their previous strength. In Germany, the quest for national unity led to the abrogation of many old laws that sought to enforce religious uniformity. Throughout Europe, political and economic liberalism had similar consequences. This in turn contributed to the growth of what were called free churches, that is, those to which one belongs by choice and supports by means of offerings, in contrast to the state churches supported by state funds. The Methodists and Baptists spread throughout Germany and Northern Europe. In general, the lack of state support renewed the zeal of many Protestants in Europe, drawing great numbers to the various aspects of the church's work. So this is a period of time in which church and state is separating, and it actually becomes a very healthy time for churches, particularly for Protestant churches. So before we finish out today, we need to look at one other group, and that is what's going on in Great Britain during this time. Throughout the 19th century, Great Britain followed a course parallel to that of continental Europe, so a lot of the same stuff. The rapid growth of cities that resulted from industry and increased trade gave rise to overcrowded slums, and the poor found themselves living and working in conditions of misery. So economic conditions not great in Great Britain either. Meanwhile, economic and political liberalism made great strides, increasing the power of the House of Commons at the expense of the House of Lords. So as it was in the rest of Europe, particularly in France, more power to the kind of the middle class group, the upper, higher middle class bourgeois type group, less power for the ruling class and the aristocracy, the nobility. These conditions led a vast wave of migration out of Great Britain and the labor movement, which made enormous progress between the beginning of the century and the end of the century. It was also in England that Karl Marx developed many of his economic theories. So a lot of people actually left, but those who stayed around, they were able to get some stuff started to make some changes. All this influenced the church. During the 19th century, there was a significant renewal in the Church of England. Those who sought a more faithful church came to the foreground. They were heavily influenced by Pietism and wished to see the Church of England more clearly aligned with the rest of Protestantism. So in the Anglican Church, there's a lot of the same abuses that we read about through the years of people getting offices that didn't deserve them and really not taking care of people and just trying to get gain for themselves. That was going on. And people in the country had seen it, and they wanted Reformation to happen. Others, especially those of the Oxford movement, went the opposite way and became known as Anglo-Catholics. They were influenced by Romanticism and Eastern Orthodoxy. The Oxford movement emphasized the authority of tradition, apostolic succession, and communion at the center of Christian worship. So this group's way more of the old school group at this time. However, it was among dissident churches where the most vitality was found during the 19th century. The growth of the middle class brought an upsurge in the membership of dissident churches. Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists showed many signs of vigor in their numerical growth and in the many societies that they founded to help the needy, remedy blatant social ills, and spread the gospel around the world. So you see within these churches that are not associated with the Church of England, a lot of growth, a lot of vitality, and a lot of passion for trying to right the wrongs that they had seen, not just within the church itself, but also in society in general, and also to spread the gospel around the world. The support and inspiration of Methodists, Quakers, and others were important factors in the birth of labor unions, in prison reform, and in legislation regarding child labor. So they're all about trying to help societal conditions to be better, and they went a long way to do that, but there's one thing they did that shines above all others. But the most significant accomplishment of British Christians during the 19th century was the abolition of slavery in most of the Western world. And we say most because we know that didn't happen in the United States. Not then, anyway. Due to the efforts of William Wilberforce and other committed Christians, the British government took measures against slavery in 1806 and 1811. These measures led most Western nations to abolish slavery in a short period of time. The reason these measures did that is because Britain wouldn't do business with with countries that didn't abolish it. And at that period of time, you couldn't really get by without that. So when that stand came into place, people got rid of slavery because it wasn't beneficial to them. It was going to hurt them more than it helped them. And Great Britain stood out. The Christians in that country started the movement of getting rid of slavery. And we can look back in history and look at a lot of abuses of the church, particularly in our country. We talked about some of those last week, got my blood pressure up again. In this instance, we're seeing the right thing being done. And it needs to be remembered that the people of God are the ones who stood up against these social ills. They said, no more of this. And so when people ask questions about, like, why didn't Jesus just stop slavery? He did it. Why didn't Jesus just get equal rights for people? He did. He didn't do it by just attacking the symptoms of the problem. He did it by solving the actual disease, and that's sin. And what God knows is that as people are changed by the gospel, as people's lives are changed from the inside out as a result of having a relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ, it's going to change the way they deal with other people. And a result of that, finally, is that people have seen, true believers of Christ have seen, this is not the way to do things. And it changed everything in this world. It wasn't these people that were appealing to reason and science that came up with this. It was God's people that did it. And they put it into institutions that have been in existence for as long as the world had turned with people on it. They should be remembered for that. And praise God that his gospel changes the hearts and lives of human beings. I'm so thankful to get to end on a positive note today. So we are going to end there on that positive note. Thanks for taking time today. We will continue this study next week as we continue through our study of the history of Christianity. Until that time, hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.